The message arrived at 3:47 hours, 3 words that would haunt Captain Isabel Voss for the next 16 minutes. "Don't wait for me." She stared at her phone in the ready room at Bagram Airfield, the screen's glow cutting through pre-dawn darkness. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rahan, her former weapons officer, now leading a reconnaissance team somewhere in the Kunar Valley. The text made no sense. His convoy wasn't due back for another 6 hours. She tried calling back. Nothing. Tried again. Straight to voicemail. Something in her chest tightened, that old instinct from her first tour screaming that silence meant trouble. The operations center was chaos when she burst through the door, still wearing her flight suit from the previous day's mission. A major she didn't recognize was shouting coordinates into a radio. Two intelligence officers hunched over a laptop, satellite imagery reflected in their glasses. She caught fragments. Contact with hostile forces. Multiple casualties. Pinned down. Then she heard Rahan's call sign, Archer 6. Her breath stopped. The major turned, saw her in the doorway. "Voss, you're not scheduled for," she cut him off. "That's my team out there. Where are they?" He hesitated, and in that pause she understood everything. Rahan's convoy had driven into an ambush. Taliban fighters had them surrounded in a narrow valley with no air support available. The nearest Apache was 40 minutes out. The major's eyes said what his mouth wouldn't. Rahan and his men were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. Isabel grabbed the mission brief from the desk, scanning elevations and coordinates with 15 years of combat experience translating terrain into tactical options. The valley was a death trap, barely wide enough for rotary wing extraction, surrounded by ridgelines perfect for enemy fighters. Fixed wing couldn't help. Too narrow, too much risk. Unless... "I can reach them in 12 minutes, she said. The major blinked. "In what? You don't have the Hog, Alpha 17, she's fueled and armed." His face shifted from confusion to something close to horror. "Voss, that's insane. You can't fly close air support in terrain like that. The approach angles are impossible." She was already moving toward the door. "Then it's a good thing impossible is just an opinion." Her crew chief, Technical Sergeant Jamal Torres, was performing post-flight checks on the A-10 Thunderbolt II when she sprinted across the flight line. The aircraft sat under floodlights like some prehistoric creature, gray paint scarred from 100 missions, the massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon protruding from its nose like a promise. Torres looked up, read her expression, and immediately started prepping for launch. "How bad?" he asked. "Worst case," she answered, climbing the ladder. "Then come back," he said simply. She was airborne in 4 minutes, the Hog's twin turbofans pushing her into darkness as Bagram's lights fell away below. The cockpit was familiar as her own skin, every switch and gauge memorized through countless hours. She clicked into the tactical frequency, heard the controlled panic of men fighting for their lives. Archer 6's voice came through, tight with pain but still commanding. "All positions, conserve ammunition. Air support inbound, ETA unknown." He didn't know she was coming. She keyed her mic. "Archer 6, this is Viper 3-1, 8 minutes out with 30mm and Mavericks. Paint your targets." The radio went silent for 3 seconds. When Rahan responded, his voice cracked slightly. "Viper 3-1, negative. Valley approach is too narrow for fixed wing. Recommend you start marking targets, Sergeant. I'm not asking permission." She pushed the throttles forward, watching her airspeed climb as the Hindu Kush mountains rose like jagged teeth against the stars. The A-10 wasn't built for speed. It was built for survival, for punishment, for delivering hell to anyone stupid enough to shoot at American troops. At 15,000 feet, she began her descent into the valley system, navigating by terrain, radar, and memory. The briefing photos hadn't lied. The valley was barely 400 meters wide at its broadest point, with sheer rock walls rising 2,000 feet on either side. Flying through it would be like threading a needle at 300 knots. In the dark, while people shot at her, she'd done worse. The AN/ALQ-184 electronic countermeasures pod hummed beneath her wing, ready to confuse any surface-to-air missiles. Her hands moved across the weapons panel, selecting the GAU-8, chambering high-explosive incendiary rounds. 65 rounds per second, each one the size of a milk bottle, capable of shredding anything short of a main battle tank. She checked her fuel. Enough for maybe 40 minutes of loiter time if she was conservative. She wouldn't be conservative. Archer 6, Viper 3-1 approaching from the southeast. I need eyes on your position and hostile concentrations. Rehan's response came amid the sharp crack of rifle fire. Viper, we're at grid Quebec Whiskey 746321, taking fire from ridgelines east and west. Estimate 40 to 50 hostiles. We've got 3 urgent casualties and 1 vehicle immobile. She punched the coordinates into her targeting computer, watched the tactical display populate with terrain data. The convoy was trapped in a bottleneck where the valley narrowed to barely 200 meters. Enemy fighters owned the high ground on both sides, classic ambush positioning. This was going to be surgical. Copy all, Archer 6. Danger close is authorized. Keep your heads down. She heard him relay the warning to his men, heard the change in their voices when they realized what danger close meant. 30mm cannon fire would be hitting within 50 meters of their position. One targeting error and she'd kill the people she was trying to save. The valley walls appeared in her night vision, massive stone barriers lit in shades of green. She dropped to 500 feet above the valley floor, felt the airframe shudder as she threaded between the ridgelines. Her targeting pod swiveled, thermal imaging painting the world in heat signatures. There. Muzzle flashes on the eastern ridge, at least 15 positions. More on the western side, dug in behind rocks. The convoy's vehicles appeared as 3 bright spots in the valley bottom, and around them, the smaller signatures of men crouched behind inadequate cover. She armed the GAU-8, selected the eastern ridge for her first pass. The A-10 rolled level, nose dropping slightly as she acquired the target. Her finger rested on the trigger. Archer 6, guns in 30 seconds, eastern ridge. Everyone gets flat and stays flat. Rehan's acknowledgement was barely audible over the roar of gunfire. She counted down silently, watching the targeting reticle settle over the enemy positions. 20 seconds. 15. At 10 seconds out, something hit her left engine. The cockpit filled with warning tones as the fire detection system screamed. She glanced at the gauges, saw the left turbofan's temperature spiking into the red. The A-10 yawed left and she compensated with right rudder, keeping the aircraft stable through sheer muscle and experience. The targeting solution held. 5 seconds. She squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 spoke with a sound like the sky tearing in half, a sustained roar that shook the entire aircraft. The cannon's recoil actually slowed her forward velocity, each round leaving the barrel at 3,400 feet per second. She walked the fire across the eastern ridge, watched through the targeting pod as the high-explosive rounds impacted rock and flesh. The enemy positions disappeared in a line of detonations, each explosion bright white in the thermal display. She released the trigger after a 3-second burst, already banking hard to line up the western ridge. The left engine was still screaming warnings, and now she smelled smoke in the cockpit. The Hog could fly on one engine. She'd done it before. She armed the remaining Maverick missile, designated a concentration of fighters near a large boulder, and fired. The missile streaked away, leaving a trail of fire that lit the valley walls. The Maverick impacted with a blast that echoed off the mountains, a kill radius that eliminated 8 hostile signatures from her thermal display. But more were appearing, fighters moving up from positions further down the valley. They'd called in reinforcements. This wasn't just an ambush. This was a coordinated assault meant to wipe out Rehan's entire team. She keyed her radio to the tactical frequency. All Viper elements, this is Viper 3-1. I need immediate support at my position. Multiple hostiles and I'm flying wounded. The response came from Viper 2-7, Captain Marcus Chen, somewhere over Kandahar province. 3-1-2-7 is 40 minutes out. Can you hold? She looked at her fuel gauge, at the warning lights illuminating her console, at the thermal display showing more enemies moving into firing positions. -2-7. These troops need extraction now. I'm staying until they're out. There was a pause, then Chen's voice came back quieter. Copy, Isabel. We're coming. She didn't have 40 minutes. She had maybe 20 before fuel or damage forced her to break off. 20 minutes to keep 50 enemy fighters from overrunning 6 American soldiers in a valley where the mountains blocked any possibility of escape. She'd make it enough. The left engine finally gave up completely, flames shooting from the turbofan before the fire suppression system kicked in. The A-10 dropped altitude, sluggish now with only one engine producing thrust. She compensated, pushing the right throttle to maximum, feeling the asymmetric power try to spin the aircraft. Her right leg ached from constant rudder pressure, but she held the bird steady. "Archer 6, what's your situation?" Rehan's voice came back strained. "We've got them off the eastern ridge, but the west side is still hot. 2 casualties are critical. Medevac ETA is 25 minutes and we can't hold that long." 25 minutes. She had perhaps 3 gun passes left before her fuel state forced her to turn back to Bagram. After that, Rehan and his men would be alone. The choice was simple: follow regulations and leave them to die, or stay until the job was done and risk not making it back herself. It wasn't really a choice. She brought the A-10 around for another pass, lining up on the western ridge. The aircraft was handling like a truck with 3 wheels, every control input requiring twice the usual force. The hydraulic systems were compensating for the missing engine, but she could feel the hog struggling. Her targeting pod found a group of fighters moving down the ridge toward Rehan's position, trying to flank the convoy. She brought the GAU-8 to bear, waited for the tone indicating proper range, and fired. The cannon roared again, shorter bursts this time, conserving ammunition. The rounds tore through rock and flesh, and the thermal signatures disappeared. She pulled up hard, clearing the ridge by what felt like meters, and somewhere in the turn she realized she was smiling. This was what she'd been trained for. This was why she'd spent 15 years learning to fly the ugliest, toughest aircraft in the inventory. Because on days like today, when everything went to hell and good people needed a miracle, she could deliver one at 300 knots with 30-millimeter cannons and absolute certainty. The smile faded when she checked her fuel. 10 minutes of loiter time remaining, maybe less. The medevac helicopters were still 15 minutes out. She'd have to stretch every second, make every round count. She called down to Rehan. "Archer 6, I need you to mark your absolute defensive perimeter with infrared strobes. Anything outside that perimeter is hostile. Acknowledge." His response was immediate. "Viper, strobes are out. Perimeter marked." Through her targeting pod, she saw the IR strobes appear. 4 lights marking the corners of a rectangular space barely 30 meters on a side. Rehan had contracted his defense to the absolute minimum, concentrating his firepower. Smart. It also meant any enemy fighter getting inside that perimeter would be in knife-fighting range. She couldn't let that happen. She set up a patrol pattern, flying figure eights above the valley, watching the thermal display for any movement toward the convoy. Every time a heat signature appeared, she evaluated: threat or terrain, fighter or rock. She couldn't afford mistakes. Twice she fired short bursts from the GAU-8, eliminating individual fighters attempting to advance. The third time she held fire because the signature moved wrong, and seconds later saw it was a goat that had wandered into the valley. The ammunition counter clicked down with each burst. 300 rounds remaining. 200. 150. The Hog was a flying gun platform, but even the massive ammunition drum had limits. She started rationing, switching to single-shot mode for individual targets. 1 round per hostile, precision over volume. Her hands were steady on the stick, but inside she was calculating angles and odds with the part of her brain that never stopped running tactical scenarios. 7 minutes of fuel remaining. The medevac birds called in 10 minutes out, announcing their approach over the tactical frequency. She could hear the relief in Rehan's voice when he acknowledged. She could also hear how weak he sounded. He was one of the critical casualties. He'd been directing his team's defense while bleeding out from some wound he hadn't mentioned. "Archer 6, when those birds arrive, you get on first. That's not a request." His laugh was bitter. "Still giving me orders, Captain." "Always, Sergeant. Now shut up and conserve your strength." She meant to sound commanding, but it came out softer than intended. They'd flown together for 2 years before he'd cross-trained into reconnaissance. She taught him everything she knew about close air support coordination. He'd saved her life once, in a valley not unlike this one, by talking her through a systems failure when her radios had gone dead and she'd been flying on instruments and prayer. If he died here in this God-forsaken valley, while she circled overhead unable to do more than delay the inevitable. The thought vanished as 3 more heat signatures appeared on the eastern ridge. They were carrying something, tubes on their shoulders, RPGs, anti-aircraft weapons. She didn't hesitate, didn't calculate angles or danger close protocols. She rolled inverted, dropped the nose, and dove straight at the ridge with the GAU-8 screaming. The rounds tore through rock and flesh and the RPGs detonated in their carrier's hands, a secondary explosion that lit the night. She pulled up, felt the G-forces crushing her into the seat, felt the hog straining with every rivet. Something in the right wing made a sound like tearing metal, but the aircraft held together because A-10s were built by people who understood that sometimes holding together was the only victory that mattered. The ammunition counter showed 50 rounds between Rehan's team and being overrun. The medevac helicopters appeared on her radar, 2 A-60 Black Hawks coming in fast and low. She switched frequencies. Dustoff 7-1, Viper 3-1. Valley is still hot. You'll be taking fire on approach. I'm Winchester on missiles and nearly Black on gun. Winchester meant out of weapons. Black meant out of ammunition. The medevac pilot's response was calm, professional. Copy, Viper. We're coming in anyway. Clear us a door. She fired her last 50 rounds in 2 bursts, bracketing the landing zone, creating a momentary suppression that would last maybe 30 seconds. The Black Hawks descended into the valley like falling angels, their rotors beating the air into submission. She watched them land, saw the crew chiefs already out and moving toward Rehan's position, and felt something in her chest unclench slightly. The helicopters were on the ground for 90 seconds. 90 seconds while enemy fire kicked up dust around them, while the crew chiefs loaded casualties into the birds, while Rehan was carried aboard still protesting that his men should go first. Then they were lifting off, climbing out of the valley with their precious cargo, and Isabel Voss was alone in the sky above hostile territory with a crippled aircraft and fuel tanks approaching empty. She turned north toward Bagram, pushed the single working engine to maximum sustainable power, and tried not to think about the 50 miles of mountains between her and home. The aircraft was shaking now, something in the damaged wing creating harmonic vibrations that rattled her teeth. The hydraulic pressure was dropping, making the control surfaces mushy and unresponsive. She compensated by feel, making constant tiny adjustments to keep the hog stable. At 10 miles out from Bagram, the tower cleared her for emergency approach, priority landing. Fire trucks were already rolling as she limped toward the runway, the A-10 barely maintaining altitude. She extended the landing gear, heard 2 solid thumps as the main gear locked into position, heard nothing from the nose gear. The indicator light stayed dark. The nose gear was either damaged or had lost hydraulic pressure. Landing without it meant the aircraft would drop onto its nose the moment she touched down, potentially cartwheeling across the runway and killing her instantly. Or she could belly land, bringing the A-10 down on its titanium bathtub-armored underside, risking fire and catastrophic structural failure, but giving herself slightly better odds of survival. The choice was taken from her when the right engine started coughing, fuel pressure dropping below sustainable levels. She was going down whether she liked it or not. She aimed for the runway, called out her situation to the tower, and heard her own voice stay perfectly calm even as every instinct screamed. Bagram Tower, Viper 3-1. Single engine, no nose gear, fuel critical, landing immediately. The runway lights rushed up to meet her. She held the nose high, trying to keep the aircraft's attitude level as long as possible. The main gear touched with a screech of rubber. For one perfect moment, the A-10 balanced on its 2 main wheels, the nose suspended in the air by nothing but momentum and Isabel's desperate back pressure on the stick. Then gravity asserted itself. The nose dropped, hit the runway in a shower of sparks, and the aircraft ground forward in a horrific scream of tearing metal. She felt the deceleration like a fist to the chest, felt the canopy crack above her head, felt the world tumble and spin until finally, miraculously, the A-10 slid to a stop on the runway centerline, smoke pouring from a dozen breaches in its armor. She sat there for 3 seconds, checking for fire, checking her body for injuries, checking that she was actually alive. Then she popped the canopy, unstrapped, and climbed out onto the wing of the aircraft that had just saved her life by absorbing damage that would have killed any other airframe. Torres was there in seconds, crew chiefs and firefighters swarming the wounded bird. He looked at her, looked at the aircraft, and shook his head slowly. "Captain, you just landed a hog with no nose gear, 1 engine, and probably 1,000 holes in the wings." She looked at her aircraft, at the battle damage, at the scorch marks from the engine fire. "Torres," she said quietly, "she brought me home, that's all that matters." The debriefing lasted 3 hours. The mission commander, Colonel Patricia Hammond, listened to Isabel's account without interruption, occasionally making notes on a tablet. When Isabel finished, Hammond sat back and studied her for a long moment. "Captain Voss, what you did tonight violated approximately 14 regulations regarding safe flight operations, close air support protocols, and aircraft damage assessment procedures." Isabel kept her face neutral. "Yes, ma'am." Hammond's expression didn't change. "You also saved 6 American lives and eliminated approximately 40 hostile combatants who were preparing a major offensive in that sector. Intelligence estimates you disrupted an operation that would have resulted in significant coalition casualties over the next week." She paused, then added, "Staff Sergeant Rehan is in surgery now. He's expected to survive because you got medevac to his position in time. Without your intervention, he and his entire team would be body bags." Isabel felt something in her throat tighten. "Permission to visit him when he's out of surgery, ma'am," Hammond nodded. "Granted. Dismissed." Outside the debriefing room, Torres was waiting with her personal gear and a cup of coffee so strong it could strip paint. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing her the cup. She drank it in 3 long swallows, barely tasting it. Her hands were shaking now, adrenaline finally wearing off and leaving behind the hollow exhaustion that always came after combat. "The bird?" she asked. Torres grimaced. "Maintenance is evaluating, but between you and me, they're going to condemn her. Too much structural damage. She flew her last mission tonight." Isabel thought about Alpha 17, the A-10 that had carried her through 15 months in theater, that had taken fire meant for her and kept flying, that had brought her home one last time even while falling apart. Aircraft didn't have souls, not really, but sometimes they earned something like respect. "She was a good bird," she said quietly. Torres nodded. "The best." He paused, then added, "I pulled the gun camera footage. You should see it before anyone else does." They walked to the maintenance hangar where Torres had set up a laptop displaying the mission video. She watched herself thread the valley, saw the targeting solutions, saw the precision of each gun run. What struck her wasn't the skill she'd trained for this, but the margins. Every pass had been within meters of disaster. Every burst had been fired danger close to friendly positions. One mistake, one moment of hesitation or miscalculation, and she would have killed the people she was trying to save. The video showed exactly how thin the line between hero and catastrophe actually was. "Send it to my account," she said. "I want to study it." Torres nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying. She wanted to see where she'd made mistakes, where she could improve, because next time the margins might be even thinner. That was the difference between pilots who survived and pilots who became cautionary talees. The ones who survived never stopped learning from their near misses. She caught 3 hours of sleep in the transient quarters, dreamless unconsciousness that felt like falling into a void. When she woke, the sun was high and the base was in full daylight operations mode. She grabbed a quick meal at the dining facility, showered, changed into a fresh flight suit, and headed to the hospital. Rehan was awake when she arrived, propped up in bed with monitors beeping softly around him. His left shoulder was bandaged, his face pale but alert. 3 other members of his team occupied beds nearby, all watching her with expressions she couldn't quite read. "Captain," Rehan said, and his voice was stronger than she'd expected. "I heard you broke your airplane getting to us." She pulled up a chair. "The airplane will be fine. You look like hell, Sergeant." He laughed, then winced at the pain it caused. "Took a round through the shoulder. Medics say it missed everything important by about 2 centimeters. Another inch right and it would have hit the brachial artery." He paused, his expression shifting to something more serious. "I need to ask you something. That text I sent, how did you know to come?" She'd been expecting this question. "You wrote 'don't wait for me,' not 'don't wait up' or 'running late.' You wrote it like someone saying goodbye. I know you, Marcus. You don't say goodbye unless you think you're not coming back." He absorbed this, then nodded slowly. "We drove into a kill zone. They'd been planning it for days, waiting for a convoy like ours. I knew when the first RPG hit that we weren't getting out. I sent that text thinking it was the last thing I'd ever say to anyone." He met her eyes. "Then I heard your voice on the radio and I thought I was hallucinating." One of the other soldiers, a young specialist with his arm in a sling, spoke up. "Ma'am, we saw you come through that valley. Saw your aircraft light up when they hit the engine. We all thought you'd break off." Isabel looked at him, at all of them, at these men who'd fought and bled in a nowhere valley because their country had asked them to. "Then you don't know much about A-10 pilots, specialist. We don't break off. We stay until the job's done." Rehan smiled, and there was something in his expression that looked like pride. "I told them that. I said if Viper 3-1 was coming, she'd fly through hell itself before she'd leave us behind." He paused, then added quietly, "I was right." She stayed for another 20 minutes, talking about nothing important, avoiding the weight of what had happened. When she finally left, all 4 of the soldiers saluted from their beds, a gesture of respect she hadn't earned and didn't deserve but accepted because refusing would dishonor what they'd been through together. Outside the hospital, she stood in the Afghan sun and let herself feel the full weight of the night's events. 6 lives saved, 1 aircraft destroyed, 40+ enemy casualties, 14 regulation violations that would probably result in some form of official reprimand even as they were pinning a medal on her chest. This was war. This was the impossible math of combat where you spent millions in equipment to save thousands in flesh, where you broke rules to preserve lives, where winning and losing became meaningless concepts compared to the simple binary of who came home and who didn't. Her phone buzzed. A message from Colonel Hammond. "Briefing at 1600 hours. Bring coffee, it's going to be long." She smiled despite herself. The debriefing wasn't over. There would be after-action reports, investigations into the rule violations, formal inquiries into her decision-making under pressure. The Air Force didn't hand out A-10s to mavericks who ignored protocol, even when those mavericks got results. She'd have to justify every choice, defend every action, prove that what she'd done was necessary rather than reckless. The thing was, she could do that. Because she'd do it all again, exactly the same way if it meant bringing people home. That was the job. That was the promise every close air support pilot made when they strapped into the Hog. The briefing room at 1600 hours held more people than she'd expected. Colonel Hammond sat at the head of the table, flanked by a 2-star general Isabel didn't recognize and several officers with combat action badges on their uniforms. Torres was there, along with the maintenance chief and several intelligence officers. This wasn't a standard debriefing. This was something else. Hammond gestured for her to sit. "Captain Voss, thank you for joining us. This is General Richard Carr, Commander of Air Combat Command. He's here to discuss your mission from last night." The general was in his 50s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in cockpits before ascending to command. He studied Isabel with an expression that gave nothing away. "Captain, I've reviewed your mission footage and the after-action reports. I've also spoken with Staff Sergeant Rehan and his team. What I'm trying to understand is how you made the decision to engage in that valley given the tactical constraints." Isabel chose her words carefully. "Sir, the tactical situation was clear. Friendly forces were about to be overrun. Air support was 40 minutes away. I was 8 minutes out with the right weapons platform for the mission. The decision made itself." Carr nodded slowly. "The decision made itself. Let's talk about that. You flew into a narrow valley at night with known hostile forces on elevated positions. You engaged targets danger close to friendly positions. You continued the mission after taking significant aircraft damage. At any point did you consider the possibility that you might not make it back? The question hung in the air. Everyone in the room knew the answer, but Carr wanted to hear her say it. Yes, sir. I considered it. Then I considered what would happen to those 6 soldiers if I didn't continue the mission. The calculus was simple. The general leaned back in his chair. Simple. Captain, what you did last night was either the most brilliant piece of close air support flying I've seen in 30 years of service, or it was a reckless violation of sound tactical judgment that happened to work out. I'm trying to determine which. Isabel felt anger flash through her, hot and immediate, but she kept her voice level. With respect, sir, I'd argue it was both. Yes, I violated regulations. Yes, I took risks that probably should have killed me. But those risks were calculated based on 15 years of experience flying the A-10 and understanding its capabilities beyond what the manual says. She paused, then continued. The A-10 was built to take damage and keep fighting. It was built to fly close air support missions in contested environments. It was built to save lives when everything else has failed. Last night it did exactly what it was designed to do. I just happened to be the one flying it. Carr's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been approval. The A-10 did what it was designed to do. And what about you, Captain? Did you do what you were designed to do? The question caught her off guard. She thought about the years of training, the countless hours studying tactics and weapons employment, the missions flown and lessons learned. She thought about why she joined the Air Force in the first place, that 18-year-old version of herself who'd wanted to serve something larger than her own life. Yes, sir, she said finally. I did exactly what I was designed to do. I protected American lives. Everything else is just paperwork. The room went silent. Then Carr smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face. That's what I wanted to hear. Captain Voss, you're absolutely right. Everything else is just paperwork, and we'll handle the paperwork. He stood, and everyone in the room stood with him. What you did last night represents the finest traditions of Air Force combat aviation. You saw a situation that required action. You assessed your capabilities and the risks, and you executed a mission that saved lives. The fact that you broke some rules along the way is noted and will be addressed through official channels. But between you and me, those rules exist to prevent disasters, not to prevent heroism. Sometimes you need people who understand the difference. He extended his hand, and Isabel shook it, feeling the strength in his grip. There will be an investigation, and there will be findings, and there will probably be a letter in your personnel file about unauthorized risk-taking. There will also be a distinguished flying cross, because what you did deserves recognition even as it requires scrutiny. The Air Force is complex that way. He released her hand and picked up a folder from the table. I'm also here to deliver a personal message from Staff Sergeant Rahan. He wanted you to have this. He handed her a piece of paper, and she unfolded it to see Rahan's handwriting, slightly shaky but legible. Captain Voss, you flew through hell for us. Words don't cover it. But thank you doesn't need words. It just needs to be said. So, thank you for everything, for not giving up, for being exactly who you are. Marcus, she read it twice, feeling something tight in her chest loosen slightly. This was why she flew. Not for medals or recognition, but for moments like these, for knowing that somewhere in the world, 6 people were alive who wouldn't have been without her intervention. Everything else, the regulations, the investigations, the career implications, was just noise. Carr was watching her carefully. Captain, I need to know something, and I need you to answer honestly. If you found yourself in the same situation tomorrow with the same constraints and the same risks, would you make the same choices? She didn't hesitate. Yes, sir, without question. He nodded as if that answered something important. Good, that's what I needed to hear. Dismissed. Outside the briefing room, Torres was waiting with another cup of paint-stripping coffee. How'd it go? She took the coffee, drank deeply, let the bitter heat ground her. I think I'm simultaneously getting a medal and a reprimand. The Air Force works in mysterious ways. Torres laughed. Welcome to the club. Every good pilot I've ever known has at least one official letter of counseling in their file. They walked together across the flight line. past rows of aircraft being prepped for evening missions. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere out there, people were fighting and dying, and tomorrow she'd be back in the cockpit doing it all over again. This was the rhythm of war: violence and bureaucracy, heroism and paperwork, life and death separated by nothing more than skill and luck and the willingness to act when action was required. "Tors," she said as they reached the hangar, "you mentioned the maintenance report on Alpha 17. What's the final assessment?" His expression turned serious. "Total loss, Captain. The airframe took over 40 hits from small arms and at least 3 pieces of shrapnel from those RPG detonations. The left engine was completely destroyed. The right engine had catastrophic damage that would have failed in another few minutes. Multiple hydraulic lines severed, fuel system compromised, structural members cracked or broken. The fact that Bird got you home is basically a miracle of engineering." She looked toward where they'd parked the destroyed A-10, now surrounded by maintenance equipment and inspection teams documenting every wound. She deserved better than to end like that. Tors shook his head. "Captain, that Bird ended exactly the way she was meant to, protecting her pilot and completing the mission. There's no better way for a combat aircraft to go out. She'll be remembered." He was right, she knew. Aircraft didn't have funerals, but they had legacies, and Alpha 17's legacy would be 6 saved lives and a mission flown beyond all reasonable limits. That was worth more than another few years of routine patrol flights. The next morning, Isabel was back in the briefing room for mission planning. A new A-10 had been assigned to her, fresh from depot maintenance with 0 combat hours on the airframe. Tors was already performing pre-flight inspections, making the aircraft ready for her. But first, there was the daily intelligence briefing, the weather report, the tactical situation update. The war continued whether she was ready or not. Colonel Hammond pulled her aside afterward. "Voss, I want you to know the investigation is proceeding, but it's largely a formality. General Carr's endorsement carries considerable weight. You'll probably get a counseling letter and the DFC, just like he said. Career-wise, you're fine." Isabel nodded, but something in Hammond's tone suggested there was more. "However," Hammond smiled slightly, "however, you've developed a reputation. The story of last night's mission is already circulating through the aviation community. People are calling you the pilot who flew a one-engine A-10 through a valley most pilots wouldn't attempt in a fighter jet with full systems. You're becoming something of a legend, and legends attract attention." She understood immediately. Attention meant scrutiny, meant pressure, meant every future mission would be evaluated against impossible standards. It meant being held up as an example while simultaneously being warned not to try anything that spectacular again. It was the paradox of military heroism: be brave enough to risk everything, but not so brave that you make everyone else look cautious. "I'll handle it, ma'am." Hammond's expression softened. "I know you will. Just remember, you're not invincible." What worked last night was a combination of skill, experience, and frankly, extraordinary luck. Don't let success make you reckless. The warning was delivered with genuine concern, and Isabel accepted it as such. "Understood, ma'am." She flew 3 missions over the next week, all routine patrol flights that saw no action. Each time she strapped into the new A-10, she felt the difference. This aircraft was pristine, untested, its systems responding with the crispness of machinery that hadn't yet learned to compensate for battle damage. It was objectively better than Alpha 17 had been, but it lacked something indefinable, that sense of partnership that came from surviving combat together. On the 8th day, she visited Rehan in the hospital again. He was recovering well, already planning his return to duty despite the protests of his medical team. They talked about the mission, walking through each moment with the analytical detachment of professionals examining their own near-death experience. "The moment I heard your first gun run," Rehan said, "I knew we'd make it. The way you walked that fire across the ridge, perfectly controlled despite everything going wrong, that's when I stopped being scared." Isabel shook her head. "I was terrified the entire time. Every trigger pull, I was calculating the odds of hitting friendly positions. Danger close doesn't begin to describe how close some of those rounds came to your perimeter. He met her eyes. But you didn't miss. That's what matters. Perfect execution under impossible conditions. That's the definition of mastery, Captain. She wanted to protest, to explain that it hadn't been perfect, that she'd been seconds away from disaster at multiple points. But she recognized the need in his voice. He needed to believe that his salvation had been inevitable, that the chaos and terror of that night had been under control even when it felt like everything was falling apart. Sometimes the truth mattered less than the story people needed to believe. "We all did our jobs," she said instead. "You kept your team together under fire. I provided air support. The medevac crews extracted you under hostile conditions. It was a team effort." Rehan nodded, but his expression said he understood what she was really saying, that heroism was usually just competence under pressure, that miracles were mostly preparation meeting opportunity, that the difference between success and failure often came down to millimeters and milliseconds rather than grand gestures. They talked for another hour, comfortable in the shared understanding of people who'd survived something that should have killed them. When she finally left, she felt lighter somehow, as if speaking about the mission had released some of the weight she'd been carrying. The weeks passed. The investigation concluded with exactly the outcome General Carr had predicted. Isabel received a formal counseling letter regarding unauthorized risk-taking and procedural violations to be placed in her permanent file. She also received the Distinguished Flying Cross in a ceremony attended by half the base, with citations reading like something from a propaganda film. Extraordinary heroism, complete disregard for personal safety, precision execution under the most adverse conditions. She accepted the medal with appropriate humility, while privately thinking that medals were just metal and ribbons, pretty symbols that meant less than the knowledge that 6 people were walking around because she'd done her job. The real recognition came in smaller moments. The crew chief who worked extra hours to ensure her aircraft was perfect before every flight, the intelligence officer who always flagged her missions as priority, the young pilots who started asking her advice about close air support tactics, treating her words like holy writ. She tried to deflect the attention, to remind people that she'd just been doing what any A-10 pilot would do, but the legend had taken on its own life. She was Viper 3-1, the pilot who flew one engine through hell and brought everyone home. 3 months later, she was back in the briefing room when a new mission came through. Another ground team trapped, another impossible tactical situation, another urgent request for close air support. The briefing officer laid out the situation with clinical precision: hostile forces, narrow approach, elevated enemy positions, limited time. Everyone in the room turned to look at her. Hammond raised an eyebrow. "Captain Voss, thoughts?" She studied the mission brief, seeing the parallels to that night 3 months ago. Different valley, different team, same fundamental problem. American lives at risk in a tactical situation that required precision and courage in equal measure. She looked at the faces around her, saw the expectation, and realized this was her life now. Every impossible mission would come to her desk. Every time someone needed a miracle, they'd call Viper 3-1. It was exhausting and exhilarating, and exactly what she'd signed up for when she'd first put on a flight suit. "Sir, I can reach them in 14 minutes, she said, and heard her own words echo the ones she'd spoken 3 months earlier. "I'll need the hog prepped and ready in 5. Hammond nodded, and Torres was already moving toward the door, heading to the flight line. The briefing room cleared as everyone rushed to support the mission. Isabel grabbed her helmet and survival gear, feeling the familiar pre-flight tension settle into her muscles. This was it. This was what she'd been designed to do, as General Carr had put it. Not just fly aircraft, but be the person who showed up when everything went wrong and somehow made it right. She walked onto the flight line where her new A-10 waited, Torres completing the final pre-flight checks. The aircraft was pristine, unmarked, ready to acquire its own scars in service of something larger than itself. She climbed the ladder, settled into the cockpit, and began the startup sequence with movements so practiced they were nearly automatic. The turbofans spooled up with their characteristic whistle, and the hog came alive beneath her hands. She taxied to the runway, received clearance from the tower, and pushed the throttles forward. They accelerated down the runway, that moment of transition when the aircraft changed from a ground vehicle to a flying machine, when the wheels left the earth and suddenly everything was possible again. She climbed into the Afghan sky, pointed the nose toward coordinates that represented people in trouble, and keyed her radio. "This is Viper 3-1. I'm inbound. Hold on."